Good morning, everybody. I'm still loving this tree here. This is what they call in the liturgy the first Sunday of Christmas. It's what's after Advent. Very rarely there's two Sundays, so they still call it the first Sunday, even though it's going to be the only one. And there's this 12 days of Christmas, which I don't know if anyone out there does it. We were talking about it this morning, but we don't really have this 12 days of Christmas. Christmas is over and we're like kind of itching to pack up and move on into the new year. And I think that's fine. I mean, the new year's happening. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start. We're going to be in Lamentations 3. That's where we're going to kind of camp out a little bit. I'm going to start in verse 22. We'll just read this. I'm going to read 22 to 24. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
So, you wouldn't know it from those verses, but Lamentations is the most sorrowful book in the entire Bible. Of course, they decided to call it Lamentations, laments, cries out to God. That's what it is about. And though it doesn't name its author, but everybody agrees pretty much across the board, it was most certainly Jeremiah writing these. And so he's known as the weeping prophet. That's what he's called throughout history, the weeping prophet. Okay? And the reason, really, is he was given a fool's errand as his entire life's work. He knew from the beginning that nothing that he did would turn out, right? I'm going to read it here in Jeremiah 7. So this is kind of after his commissioning, and this is where God's instructing him to go and talk to the people, and he tells them this. Jeremiah 7, verse 27 and 28. So you shall speak all these words to them, but they will not listen to you. You shall call to them, but they will not answer you. And you shall say to them, this is the nation that did not obey the voice of the Lord their God and did not accept discipline. Truth has perished. It is cut off from their lips. So as Jeremiah is writing Lamentations, he's writing a book of poetry, thinking about the destruction that has happened to the city. So the city of God, where he's supposed to minister to these people and talk to them and tell them about God, and tell them what God is saying and instruct them to repent and turn from their ways. They have not done it, as he knew they wouldn't. And the city is destroyed. Babylon has come in, completely destroyed everything. It's in complete ruins. The temple is destroyed, like the Solomon's temple. This amazing thing is just rubble. The palace is in shambles. The walls are burned. Everything is just gone. And all of the people, some of them scattered to different places, but a lot of them were taken as exiles to Babylon. And so this is what he's writing this book of poetry out of, this thing that just happened to his home. The original collection of these 5 poems, like when people have found them in the scrolls and stuff, it's just, the title is not Lamentations, it's just how. Because how is the first word of the first line. It's also the first word of a few other lines. But it just has this, how. And it's hard to read. The whole thing is just gloom and doom. Every single line is just sadness, shame, failure. Some of Jeremiah's anger comes out in it. He's just, this idea of like, if you only would have listened. Look at the destruction. Look at where we are. We're in exile now. We're being ruled by pagans. We do not have, all of the things that God gave to us are ripped from us. And so the cycle of God's people is this way. And of course, Jeremiah knew it would be this way. We just read it. We just read that God told him, these people will not obey. This will be the people that you will speak to them. And they did not accept discipline. They did not obey the voice of the Lord. He knew. And yet he sits there and he has to think, how? How could this happen when he's actually faced with this much destruction that sin wreaked havoc? He sits and says, how? So the people of God, we know though, they live in this cycle. They go away from God They turn from his ways. They go into destruction. God usually rescues them, redeems them, sends a prophet. Sometimes they ignore him, sometimes they don't. But he brings them back. He forgives them. He redeems them. They start to live better again. And then around and around we go. They fall away. This is the cycle of God's people. So if Lamentations, if this book of poetry is just full of distress and sadness, it really is, when you read this book, it's just line after line. It's hard to read. Why is it that the verses that we remember are the ones I started with? These hope-filled new mercies are here every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion. I will hope in him. And I mean, is it just because we like to pick and choose what we like in the Bible? And so we find this book, huge book of poetry, and we say, all this sadness. I like this good stuff. And we pick it out, we write it on journals or whatever. And I mean, that's probably a little bit correct. I mean, we're not going to, write down in our journal, Israel was terrible. It just doesn't, you don't want to go back and read that again. So yeah, that's fine. We're humans. But this book, actually, there's a reason that we're drawn to this place. Or there's a reason we should be. And I want to look at that a little bit. It's written in what's called a chiasm, or chiastic structure. And so you have to dig deep to get some of this stuff. It's hard because the Bible is perfectly sufficient for teaching, for our salvation in English. There's no reason we can't come to this book with nothing else but these words and read it and find salvation and find the gospel. But we can get more out of it. And there's a quote by John Piper in the introductions of one of his books. He starts with 2 Timothy. Paul is just talking to Timothy, just teaching him. And he says this to him. It's a really short sentence, but he says, "Think over what I say, for the Lord will give you understanding in everything." And this word think, don't just read the words and let them go by and just get basic understanding, but ponder them, sit with them. Let God illuminate them more than just what they are. And so he goes on with this quote. This is what he says. "Every book worth reading beckons with the words, 'Think over what I say.' When my sons complain that a book is too hard to read, I say, 'Raking is easy, but all you get is leaves. Digging is hard, but you might find diamonds.'" And so ever since I read that, this is how I like to go with the Bible. And of course, you can't do this when you're reading the Bible always. You need to be able to read and read and read and get the context. But when you do a deep study, when you use resources from people who have come before you, from smarter people than you, because there's a lot smarter than me, then you get these things that are so deep. And so that's over the past few sermons from Advent, I kept coming back to this theme in my prayers from Advent and in some of the sermons, new mercies. I kept saying it. It just kept coming up when I would pray. I'd say, new mercies, new mercies. So I was like, something's going on. So that's why I went here. I went to this new mercies passage, and I did a deep dive in Lamentations. What is this all about? So this is kind of the overflow of that last kind of 2 weeks of study. And it's amazing. So in our modern times, we typically write the same way. Modern writing is you kind of introduce your topic, you build your case in the middle, and then you have a conclusion at the end. That's your main point. And this is fiction or nonfiction. You'll introduce something, then you'll tell the story, and then you kind of have your main point, what you meant is at the end. In ancient writing, a lot of times it wasn't like this, especially poetry, which is what this is. And there's a few other acrostics and chiasms in the Bible. A lot of them are in the Psalms, because poetry is an art. And so so you might not see the chiasm. I'm going to go over the chiasm. It might sound boring. It's not. It's super awesome. I'm going to go over it in a minute. But you might not see it. So they had other ways to draw you into the structure. So the way this poem is written is acrostics. It's 5 poems. The first poem is 22 verses. There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Each line starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It goes in order. That's the first one. The the second poem is the same way, 22 verses. It's an acrostic. So what Jeremiah was trying to do is, the Hebrew people would have seen this. They would have just seen their alphabet on the right side, because Hebrew's backwards. But they would have seen their alphabet in order, A, B, C, and they would have said, wait. Jeremiah is not just trying to show us the words here. He wants us to also look at how he wrote it. There's something there, more than just the meaning of the words. He wrote it a specific way on purpose. A, B, C, or there's this like aleph, bet. I don't know the whole thing. I know 2 letters, so I said them. I know more than 2 letters, but not all 22 in order. So anyway, that's why he wrote the acrostic, is to push them in and say, wait, there's more to this. There's structure. So I'll just go through it. So like I said, 22 verse alphabetical acrostic, first poem. Next chapter, same thing. The third chapter, which if you're paying attention, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3 would be in the middle, okay? A chiasm is where it's written where it's like a mountain, where it's like a mirror, okay? When you write a chiasm, the focus is in the middle, not at the end, not in the conclusion the way we write. It's in the middle. And so you build it up. And so actually, let me keep going with this. Chapter 3 is 66 verses, not 22. So it's actually 3 acrostics. But there's 3 letters of the alphabet, 3 letters of the next one, 3 letters of the next one. Then the fourth, another acrostic, 22 verses, same thing. And then we get to the 5th, and this is where it's so interesting. This is where like I'm studying this, and I'm like, because there's a big debate about why he did this, and I'm pulling towards one way. But then the last one, also 22 verses, but not an alphabetical acrostic. People are like, why? You have this beautiful structure, right? You have perfect acrostic, a triple acrostic. Gives it away in the 5th one. Like all the symmetry's gone. And I think from reading, and this is exciting to me. I hope y'all are excited. I'm trying to get your blood going with these acrostics here. But the last one, I've just talked about how the people of God live in this pattern, right? They live in a pattern of sin. They fall away from God. God brings them back and loves them and shows them amazing things, and they're close for a while, and they break again, and they go into sin. And I think Jeremiah, with this pattern, is saying, we're in a pattern. We're in a pattern. We're in a pattern. He wants them to break the pattern like he did at the end. He wants his people to not do the same thing. Let's not fall into sin again. Let's stay close to God. Let's break the pattern. So that's my acrostic thought for that. So the chiasm, right? So what's cool is if you lay this out, I'm like trying to, need a piece of paper or something. You have the 22, you have the 22, you have the 66 verses, you have the 22 and the 22. It literally looks like a mountain if you lay the poems out, right? And so he wants you to see this, and he wants to draw you to the center. And so if you go to the very center, so you got 22, 22, the 22 verses in the middle, basically, it's kind of that chunk. That's where I started. Those positive verses that we love of Lamentations, that are surrounded by sadness and sorrow, those good promises, that's that peak. That's the chunk that the chiasm wants to point you to. So it's not just our humanness that wants to go into this middle piece and say, we just like the good stuff. Like Jeremiah is literally saying, I'm surrounding us with destruction, but I want you to find this in the middle. This is where it is. So I'm going to read the rest of that. I'm going to start in verse 25. So this is Lamentations 3:25. We typically stop with the new mercies, but it keeps going, and it's great. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. Put your mouth in the dust is like full-on repentance, okay? But there may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults. For the Lord will not cast off forever. But though he cause grief, he will have compassion, according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not afflict from his heart, or grieve the children of men, to crush underfoot all the prisoners of the earth, to deny a man justice in the presence of the Most High, to subvert a man in his lawsuit, the Lord does not approve. Who has spoken, and it came to pass, unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? Why should a living man complain, a man about the punishment of his sins? Let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and hands to God in heaven. So yes, we do pick and choose what we want to memorize in the Bible. But in this case, Jeremiah is pulling us here on purpose. This is what he wants his people who have just dealt with, they deserved it. We read it right there. What does it say? Why should a living man complain about the punishment of his sins, right? They deserved it, but they're still feeling this. They're probably feeling regret, but everything they've ever known is gone. Everything they've ever loved, everything that they took for granted is just gone. They've been taken into exile. And this is the message that Jeremiah has for them. And he wants them to camp out here. He gives them this piece of art, this poetry that they feel. They're reading all these words, this sadness and sorrow. And it's what they need at the time. There's like, yes, this is where we are. But when they see those acrostics and they're drawn into the structure, and then they see the chiastic structure, and they go to that middle piece and they say, this is the word of the Lord that Jeremiah has for us. This is where he wants us to camp out on the peak of this mountain, and these good promises. And so one of the things that I see is where it says right here, this is verse 37, when we start there. And this is kind of the end chunk of that peak. This is where he really wants them to get. Who has spoken and it came to pass unless the Lord has commanded it? Which we know in Jeremiah 7, that before all this went down, he told Jeremiah, you're going to say all this stuff and they're not going to listen. The city's going to be destroyed. What has come to pass unless the Lord has commanded it? Okay. Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? So I'm reminded of, obviously, Joseph, what man means for evil, God means for good, over and over. And we see it here too, that the destruction that we see, so if we're looking still at this chiastic structure, and each side is representative of the destruction, each side of the mountain, sorrow and destruction. But it brings you have to go up the side of the mountain, you have to climb up through the sin, sadness, sorrow, destruction, to get to the promises, to get to the grace. This is the cycle that we have of God, where, think of the prodigal son, right? Light is not bright. It's not at its brightest until you've been in the darkness. When you're in the dark and you go out into the bright, you notice it. When you've just been sitting in the light for a long time, you kind of forget it's there. The prodigal son had to go out and had to basically destroy his life to realize what he had. And then after that, he was just going to go back in shambles, and that's when he received grace. And he would never have felt that grace. I mean, we don't want to be the prodigal son. But this destruction that these people went through, this is what we need as sinful people. We have to feel and we have to understand. We don't have to sin, but we have to understand and recognize sin in ourselves so that we can see the grace of God. If we walk around and pretend that we're good, then the grace of God, we just won't taste it. We have to understand that we're sinful. We have to look around. So to me, this is a great message, especially going into a new year. But we, in our culture, it's similar right now. We can look around and see churches are failing. Churches are closing. Church attendance is dwindling. Sin is more and more approved and affirmed in our culture. It's everywhere, and it's celebrated in a lot of places. And so we're seeing sin wreaking havoc on our world. And so we are these people. We don't get to be, we have to be, right? The good and bad comes from God. But Jeremiah's people were exiles, and that's what we are. We are people who are citizens of God's kingdom, and we're living in exile here until our king returns. And so we live like these people in exile. And like these people in exile, we can look to these promises. This is where Jeremiah wants to pull us. He wants to pull us into this part of Lamentations. He wants to say, look at the words of these poems. This is your life. It's hard. There's good there, but it's hard. There's sin in this world. But I want you to come here to this peak, in the chiasm of these poems. And so I just want to read those. I'm just going to read a little selection of them, but these are the promises that I want us to hold on to as we go into the new year. Just like the people of God lived in a pattern of sin, we live in a cycle. God does it on purpose. We talked about it. If it was Christmas all year, you wouldn't care about Christmas. We have seasons. And so we get to the end of the year, it's the last day. We get to put what's behind us away, figuratively, and start fresh. These are new mercies. This is exactly what Lamentations is talking about. But we get to figuratively do it with the year, how it kind of changes for us, and we get to literally do it in our hearts. So I'm going to read these, and this is what we're going to go out on. This is just a selection of Lamentations 3 again, and so I just want you to keep these with you as we go into the new year.